one of the early chapters of the excellent book by science journalist Nicholas Wade, A Troublesome Inheritance, he states the following, quote, "Science is about what is, not what ought to be. Its shifting sands do not support values, so it is foolish to place them there." End quote. Since the publication of the book, he has received no small amount of what appears to be largely illegitimate criticism based on political bias and left-leaning cover-it-up ideology of the sort that denies genetic differences between populations and the relationship of those differences to what we refer to as culture. For untold decades now, the ideological pall overlaid on any discussion concerning race or genetics has prevented fruitful and honest discussion, and the reasons for this can be understandable. Much of the pseudoscience of quote-unquote race as a social construct was founded on the fear of what ideology can do when it is seemingly wedded to science. I say seemingly because much of the early 20th century investigation of biology as it pertains to race was a mixed bag of truth and untruth. But as Nicholas Wade himself states, science is about how the world is, and any ideological appendage welded onto it will always be divorced from science's proper execution. This is not to say that you cannot use the results and information gleaned from science to improve society or further civilization, or even fundamentally change our world, but that exercise in and of itself is not science, and it is only by remaining objective that we can attain the best results possible in trying to accurately maximize our understanding of the world and the human workings within it. In this vein, I wish to explore some of the more recent discoveries in the field of genetics related to certain alleles that may partially explain why East Asian civilization developed along such differentiated lines when compared to Western civilization. I do not claim that what I'm about to discuss is all-inclusive, and as time goes on, there will almost certainly be more information on the subject matter to draw upon. Following the discussion of alleles and genetics will be a further discussion on the specific cultural manifestations we can observe in East Asian society that differentiate themselves from Western ones and correlate with the genetic findings. However, before I proceed, I wish to address a philosophical problem posed by those whom I might call culturalists, or in other words, those people who propose culture is everything and exists in a vacuum. One of the most problematic issues that arises from the premise that culture precedes all else is that the proponents of this worldview inevitably find themselves in a pitfall not all too dissimilar to that of theists, which is to say, the problem of infinite regress. Theologians have long grappled with the idea of an eternal God, one that always was, has been, and is, and yet will simultaneously insist on the need for a creator who creates things as pertains to terrestrial matters. They fall into a trap of their own making, whereby their insistence on the necessity of creation presupposes just such a creation for their creator God. This is called, of course, the problem of infinite regress. Culturalists have a similar but far more egregious problem, because the problems of theology are abstract and by and large unprovable in concrete terms. The famous quandary of how many angels can dance on a pinhead comes to mind, yet those of biology, civilization, genes, and history all fall within a time span that allows for much of it to be tracked, documented, and understood. In this light, infinite regress is even more absurd when applied to the culturist theories and ideas than it is for theologians. If culture were ever the force that shapes humans and human civilizations, what, pray tell, came before it? We can safely argue that culture is very much a human thing, and modern humans, in a most generous estimation, have only been on the planet for some 200,000 years, of which there have been perhaps 70,000 or maybe 50,000 years of culture. And this comes at the backdrop of documentation of life forms harking back well over 1 billion years, as evidenced by the emergence of the first prokaryotes or eukaryotes, and thereupon countless streams of all manner of life, ranging from the insectoid to reptilian, avian, and mammalian, not a single version of which ever displayed anything that so much as remotely resembled what we might call and recognize as culture, and yet we are asked, no, we are set upon by the demand that we accept that culture always has been the singular and only shaping factor in determining the structure and form of human societies. Could it not be more plausible that biology, inasmuch as it has been present for more than 1 billion years, long preceding any known culture, has been a far greater informant of human culture than the abiogenetic theory offered by the ideological culturist? I believe so, and will now examine some of these factors. I personally don't find the term race terribly useful in a scientific context, because within any given race, there are multiple genetic populations, and whilst it might be a useful ideological tool, I eschew its use if only for reasons of accuracy. Moving on, Separate genetic populations are defined by relative allele frequency, which is to say, in a certain genetic population, allele X will be more frequently found in that population than in other populations, which can and does give rise to phenotypic traits and features not typically represented in populations lacking the same percentage of allele representation. It is simply the preponderance of a given population's tendency to carry certain alleles that leads to identifiable traits in a population that differentiate them from other genetic populations. The East Asian epicanthal fold is one such phenotypical trait that arises from the frequency of alleles that are responsible for it, but Europeans too at times can have an epicanthal fold, just at much lower frequencies. In this light, we are not speaking of defining characteristics so much as we are descriptive, which even in a certain population with likely attributes can vary. Also essential for understanding the topic at hand is the term polymorphism. Polymorphism itself is always related to genetics, but genetic polymorphism is more narrowly defined. Genetic polymorphism is defined as the occurrence in the same population of two or more alleles at one locus, each with appreciable frequency, where the minimum frequency is typically taken as 1%. More broadly put in terms of biology, it is a discontinuous genetic variation leading to the expression of different types of individuals within a species. An example of genetic polymorphism leading to differentiated phenotypic outcomes is the existence of the allelic variety that gives rise to different blood types in humans. Another example of this would be jaguars that appear as panthers, or melanin-rich or black fur, as opposed to the more typically light color one sees in most jaguars. The darker coat is the result of allelic variants of the gene that codes for coat color in that species. 5-HTT-LPR is a serotonin transporter polymorphism with primarily two variations, a short S and a long L variant. The primary observation made by researchers concerning it is its relationship to affective disorders, such as anxiety and depression. Cultural psychologists broadly define societies along the lines of being either collectivist or individualist. Individualist societies are generally defined as valuing self-expression, independent thinking, and a lack of interdependent connectedness between people in said society. Whereas by contrast, the collectivist society focuses on the value of group cohesion over individual expression, where the individual is seen to be part of the greater whole rather than a separate part. Traditionally, European societies can loosely be defined as individualist and East Asian societies as collectivist. Discoveries of the past decade have indicated that the aforementioned serotonin transporter polymorphism may well have broader implications on the structure of society within the context of individualism and collectivism. Quote, culture gene coevolutionary theory posits that cultural values have evolved, are adaptive, and influence the social and physical environments under which genetic selection operates. Here, we examine the association between cultural values of individualism, collectivism, and allelic frequency of the serotonin transporter functional polymorphism 5-HTT-LPR, as well as the role this culture-gene association may play in explaining global variability in prevalence of pathogens and affective disorders. We found evidence that collectivistic cultures are significantly more likely to comprise individuals carrying the short S allele of the 5-HTT-LPR across 29 nations. Results further show that historical pathogen prevalence predicts cultural variability in individualism, collectivism owing to genetic selection of the S allele. Additionally, cultural values and frequency of S allele carriers negatively predict global prevalence of anxiety and mood disorders. Finally, mediation analyses further indicate that the increased frequency of L allele carriers predicted decreased anxiety and mood disorder prevalence owing to increased collectivistic cultural values. Taken together, our findings suggest culture gene coevolution between allelic frequency of 5-HTT-LPR and cultural values of individualism and collectivism, and support the notion that cultural values buffer genetically susceptible populations from increased prevalence of affective disorders. Implications of the current findings for understanding culture, gene coevolution of human brain and behavior, as well as how this coevolutionary process may contribute to global variation and pathogen prevalence and epidemiology of affective disorders, such as anxiety, depression, are discussed, end quote. Likewise, a similar but different study gives the following overview. Quote, Genes and culture are often thought of as opposite ends of the nature-nurture spectrum, but here we examine possible interactions. Genetic association studies suggest that variation within the genes of central neurotransmitter systems, particularly the serotonin 5-HTT-LPR, MAOA-UVNTR, and opioid OPR-M1A11AG, are associated with individual differences in social sensitivity, which reflects the degree of emotional responsiveness to social events and experiences. Here we review recent work that has demonstrated a robust cross-national correlation between the relative frequency of variance in these genes and the relative degree of individualism, collectivism in each population, suggesting that collectivism may have developed and persisted in populations with a high proportion of putative social sensitivity alleles because it was more compatible with such groups. Consistent with this notion, there was a correlation between the relative proportion of these alleles and lifetime prevalence of major depression across nations. The relationship between allele frequency and depression was partially mediated by individualism collectivism, suggesting that reduced levels of depression in populations with a high proportion of social sensitivity alleles is due to greater collectivism. These results indicate that genetic variation may interact with ecological and social factors to influence psychocultural differences." End quote. The implications of these findings are powerful and shatter the long-upheld myth we are fed that culture exists in a vacuum independent of biology. Rather, the two, like any product of evolution, are interactive and exist as a feedback loop. The serotonin transporter gene, SLC6A4, regulates serotonin neurotransmissions and contains, as previously mentioned, the polymorphism 5-HTT-LPR with allelic variance S and L. The S variant is associated with greater capacity for anxiety, depression, harm avoidance, and fear, and interestingly, the frequency of occurrence of the S variant is far greater in East Asian populations than in European ones. Yet, the result of this is counter to what one would expect. Rather than experiencing greater prevalence of the above-mentioned symptoms, East Asians, on average, experience less of it. The best hypothesis for this on hand is that the increased occurrence of the S variant is the result of earlier pathogen exposure, which in turn led to the cultural adaptive selection of the S variant because it favored collective identity and banding together, which is beneficial in dealing with pathogens and the resultant diseases. At the same time, when harmony and social cohesion are favored over individuality, such a population is possibly better insulated against the typical behaviors associated with the S variant of the 5-HTT-LPR through a robust support system and feeling of connectedness and lack of separation. This is what is referred to as cultural biological coevolution. Traits are selected for because of short-term benefit that later evolve into defining traits of a particular society. Here, the S variant being selected for as a possible means of dealing with pathogens and later having other benefits, such as the reduction of environmental stress due to collectivistic behavior. Another study cites the following in support of a multifaceted benefit to the S variant of 5-HTT-LPR. Quote, "One important variable potentially influencing the relationship between the 5-HTT-LPR, stress, and psychological state may be the positivity of the social environment. Thus, the association of the short allele with sensitivity to negative events appears to be only half the story. In a study of depressive symptomatology, when S-variant individuals had experienced more positive than negative events over the last 6 months, they had the lowest levels of depressive symptomatology in the sample, indicating that short individuals are more sensitive to positive life events as well as negative ones. Subsequent research has shown that this relationship between life events and affect for individuals with short genotypes was primarily driven by the social events, as the non-social events were not significantly related to affect. Other groups have found heightened sensitivity to positive social influences amongst short allele carriers as well, which has even been documented using neurochemical measures. Thus, these results suggest that the 5-HTT-LPR moderates sensitivity to social influence regardless of its valence." End quote. In light of this, the S variant of 5-HTT-LPR presents itself as a two-way mirror, where both the positive and the negative effects of the environment can be amplified. This will have important consequences later as I discuss Korean social issues. Conversely, people with the L variant of 5-HTT-LPR who who are predominantly European, whilst technically being less inclined to suffering from affective disorders, such of the sort mentioned prior, tend to have higher rates of depression, anxiety, and related effects, as can be seen from these maps. The authors of another study discussed the importance of other polymorphisms in relation to social sensitivity. The M-opioid receptor is associated with distress related to the severing of social bonds, and it persists in importance from infancy to adulthood. Quote, in line with this hypothesis, a functional polymorphism, A11AG in the M-opioid receptor gene, was recently associated with self-reported dispositional sensitivity to rejection, as measured by sensitivity to rejection scale. The A118G polymorphism is a slightly different type of polymorphism than the 5-HTT-LPR. In this case, there is a single letter in the DNA code that is changed, an A to a G, rather than a stretch of DNA that is different between the two alleles, as is the case with 5-HTT-LPR. In particular, it was the G allele that was associated with greater sensitivity to rejection. Additionally, this group also assessed the relationship of the A118G polymorphism to neural response during an actual episode of rejection in which the participant was excluded from an online ball-tossing game with two supposed others. Consistent with the findings using the trait measure of sensitivity to rejection, individuals carrying the G allele also had greater levels of neural response to this rejection episode within multiple brain areas known to be involved in the processing of physical pain, dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, and anterior insula. Thus, according to both self-report and neural data, genetic variation in the M-opioid receptor is associated with sensitivity to social rejection. End quote. And finally, monoamine oxidase A, or MAOA, is associated with breaking down dopamine and serotonin, and is found in greater concentrations in the brain region associated with distress related to social rejection. Quote, within the gene coding for MAOA, there is a particular form of variation, referred to as the MAOA-UVNTR, that is associated with differences in the expression of the MAOA gene. Using the previously described social exclusion task in the scanner, our group found that the MAOA-UVNTR was associated with a degree of exclusion-related neural activation such that the individuals within the low-expressing alleles had the greatest response within the portion of the anterior cingulate associated with self-reported distress to exclusion, end quote. The polymorphisms 5-HTT-LPR, A118G, MAOAU-VNTR all have a higher prevalence in East Asian populations than in European ones, as can be seen here. The higher the score of the G allele of the A118G polymorphism, the stronger the tendency towards individualism. The lower the score, the lesser the tendency, and the greater the collectivism. There are more limited data on the MAOA polymorphism, but the data that do exist are telling. The greater the frequency of the expression for the allele of MAOAU-VNTR, the greater the individualism. The lower, the greater the collectivism. These markers not only correlate with tendencies towards collectivism, but also inclination towards depression. The greater the representation of the G allele of the polymorphism A118G, the greater the lifetime prevalence of depression in the respective country. Likewise, the case with the expression of the alleles of MAOAU-VNTR, the higher the expression, the greater the coincidence of depression. The lower the expression, the lesser the occurrence of depression. What we see here is a robust correlation between the frequency of certain alleles of polymorphisms and the tendency of a country towards collectivism or individualism. But I do not think that is all she wrote, because genetics as a science is still very much in its infancy. I by no means claim that 3 distinct genetic polymorphisms covered here explain the entirety of the individualist-collectivist dichotomy that exists between the East and the West. However, in the future, I do expect more of these to be found rather than fewer, since only in recent years has it even been possible to catalog these distinctions in genetic populations, and thus as the capacity to explore human genetics increases, it is virtually inevitable that we will discover more such allelic variants that will grant us an ever clearer picture of the relationship of genes to culture and vice versa. Open questions, of course, remain with regards to other populations, such as African genetic populations, South Asian populations, Native American, and several others concerning how such allelic variants manifest in those populations, but time will tell. What also must be borne in mind, of course, are pleiotropic effects, as most complex behaviors and functions are the result of the genes having multiple effects. It will likely never be as simple as allele X of the polymorphism Y explains something uniformly. However, just as evolution is a reflection of the interplay between the environment and the biological, where actual adaptive change is a fusion of the two, rather than a result of two separate and completely distinct processes, we will almost certainly see such a convergence in the future in understanding the recent phenomenon we call human culture. The culturists will lose this debate, rest assured, because they refuse to acknowledge any biological component to society. But for now, I would like to take a magnifying glass and apply it to South Korea. And I choose South Korea for two simple reasons. First, I have lived there and am most familiar with it. And second, there are some very interesting social phenomena related to the previous discussion that could serve to elucidate crucial differences between collectivist and individualist cultures and societies. The chaebol is something I have referenced and talked about before. It literally means wealth faction in Korean, and as a concept represents the South Korean business conglomerates that have been in place for decades. They came to power in the early 1960s after a successful government coup, whereupon the government offered them huge gifts of money and unlimited support for decades on end. They're typically multinational in scope and do business across multiple sectors, with an all-powerful chairman at the helm that steers things in the direction of his choosing. Virtually all the chaebol came to power after the sundering of the Koreas and are largely still under the control of their respective founding families. Examples of these companies are Lotte, Samsung, Daewoo, Hyundai, and LG. For the longest time, until the Asian economic crisis in the late 1990s, the chaebol held absolute power within the business sector, and even after the crisis, despite some reforms implemented and imposed on them to enforce accountability on their part, they are still a mainstay. Increasingly, medium-sized businesses feel squeezed out of the market because of the dominance and, frankly speaking, corruption of the chaebol. One of the biggest criticisms of the chaebol is its nepotic structure that often seems to resemble a clan more than a business. Though I'm not here to criticize the economics of the chaebol, others have done so. Quote, the chaebol structure also has a broader economic impact. The tight control exercised by family owners is a hindrance to the liberalization of South Korea's services sector, which should be the economy's next leg of growth, Barclays economist Wai Ho-lung told CNBC, adding that the entire sector remains insular and domestic-oriented. An editorial in the Korea Times on Tuesday said that the Lotte scandal offered South Korean President Park Geun-hye the perfect chance to toughen corporate laws, including replacing owners' arbitrary decisions with legal institutions and setting stricter limits on cross-shareholding. End quote. The chaebol is often criticized because it does not necessarily focus on optimal economic outcomes, but rather petty clannish objectives. Infighting, nepotism, backstabbing are becoming increasingly common, especially in light of the fact that the original patriarchs of the chaebol are edging towards the grave, whilst their children lack the competence to take the helm. Whilst it is true that there are family-owned businesses in the West, few attain the same level of dynastic power at a national level where the chaebol itself is synonymous with Korean economic power and influence, the so-called miracle on the Han River. The major hindrance to reform is Korean society's reluctance to change, and I believe is a prime characteristic of the collectivist mindset and culture. This rigidity can prevent progress, economic or otherwise. The Korean Hagwon is essentially an after-school cram school. The Hagwon covers a myriad of subjects ranging from maths to science to English to art to music and more, and they are often attended beginning at ages as young as preschool, all the way through high school. It's important to understand that although it is claimed that the Hagwon provides an educational service not available through conventional schooling, the reality is that students arrive at the Hagwon already tired and frequently exhausted from a long day at conventional school, and are given further work and lessons on top of what they have already received from their schools. They often have little desire to be there, and the actual efficacy of the Hagwon can be called into question. For example, officially South Korea ranks number 26 in English proficiency in the world, which, when you compare that with actual investment into so-called EFL, or English as a Foreign Language education, is rather terrible. Quote, according to the Swiss-based EF Education First, the average Korean, from kindergarten through university, gets close to 20,000 hours of ESL education, mostly at Hagwons, and Statistics Korea reports that the average annual cost of private education is nearly $3,000 per student. So why do it at all if objectively the results are simply not there? For the sake of status and face, of course. Maintaining and saving face is an important element of most East Asian societies. It's probably one of the strongest single most differentiating factors when compared to Western society. Face itself is a sociological concept. In the simplest terms, it's about honor, reputation, and the way others perceive you. It's not that such a thing does not exist in the West, but rather how all-encompassing it is in Eastern society, which is directly related to their collectivist values. An example of how this contrasts with European society would be illustrative. In European tradition, we generally value truth above other considerations. Thus, if a friend made a mistake concerning geography or history in a public area, few people would be adverse to the idea of correcting him, and even if they did, it would be at worst somewhat embarrassing. Yet in a place such as Korea, such a public correction would be perceived as an admonition and cause the person to lose face in the eyes of the many, so that it's something you just don't do. I've had many encounters in the past with what I refer to as the elaborate lie, something I experienced in South Korea whilst living there. Well over 10 years ago, whilst working at a hagwon, I asked one of my Korean female colleagues out for coffee. She smiled and said she had to decline because her sister had cancer and was in the hospital and she had to visit her. I offered my condolences politely and moved on. The following week, I thought it would be polite to ask how her sister is doing, to which she replied she did not have a sister. I was very puzzled. It was only a few months later that I understood to some degree when I asked a Korean acquaintance out for coffee, and she told me her brother had been in a car accident and that she needed to see him. All well and good, but when I next saw her, I asked about the brother, and she said he was fine. And then I said, I guess the car accident wasn't that bad, to which she responded, what car accident? Lying in and of itself has no real negative or positive value in this culture. It's neutral. What you lie about and to what end, that's what counts in the context of Korean culture. Though I understood the pattern, I did not grasp at the time that the elaborate lie was part of saving face, trying to appear legitimate publicly and inoffensive, no matter what one really thinks or wants. We really don't have anything of this sort when it comes to maintaining face in European societies. As to the earlier question concerning hagwons, children attend these cram schools because the social landscape they and their parents are in demands it of them, not because it is fruitful and productive. Conformity is more important than individual expression and success, and much else is sacrificed in this model. Another interesting phenomenon is suicide. The causes of suicide are not universal. Consider the depressed American who puts a bullet into his head because of this depression. He feels helpless, worthless, as if he cannot go anywhere. And whatever the legitimacy of his claims, the suicide tends to be a reflection of his own thoughts and his own assessment of himself in relation to himself. In other words, it is an ego-driven action, or at the very least, it tends to be less a reflection of how his own shortcomings might affect society around him, and more of an issue of how society affects him. It is how I am affected by the world, rather than how I affect the world. It's a subtle but important difference. South Korea has the second highest suicide rate in the world, and the highest of any OECD country. But the causes of this, in contrast to, say, Lithuania, which ranks fourth, I will argue can and do vary. Think, for example, of the Japanese tradition of seppuku, the suicide ritual involving slicing the belly open. It was performed for several reasons, but one of the reasons was to not bring shame upon the samurai's daimyo, or feudal lord, in case his actions might have merited it, or he could have been ordered to do so by the same lord. In Japan, there has also existed a female version of the ritual, known as jigai. To my knowledge, no such formulaic ritual has ever existed in Korean history, but the motivations behind suicide are often the same. Let's look at the late South Korean president Roh Moo-hyun, who committed suicide in 2009 and was the 9th president of the Republic of South Korea. After he had left office, associates and members of his family came under suspicion of bribery and corruption. This was doubly impactful because he had previously campaigned on the promise to clean up corruption. In response, he made the following statement, quote, I have lost my moral cause just with the facts I have so far admitted. The only thing left is the legal procedure. What I have to do now is bow to the nation and apologize. From now on, the name No cannot be a symbol of the values you pursue. I am no longer qualified to speak about democracy and justice. You should abandon me, end quote. Not long after this statement, he committed suicide, having left this note, quote, I am in debt to so many people. I have caused too great a burden to be placed upon them. I cannot begin to fathom the countless agonies down the road. The rest of my life would only be a burden for others. I am unable to do anything because of poor health. I can't read, I can't write. Do not be too sad. Isn't life and death all a part of nature? Do not be sorry. Do not feel resentment towards anyone. It is fate. Cremate me, and leave only a small tombstone near my home. I've thought on this for a long time." End quote. The suicide epidemic in South Korea is not uniform, but there is always a common thread: the concept of being a burden and feeling shame. Large numbers of elderly Koreans who lack the financial resources to take care of themselves, and whose children likewise lack such resources, often commit suicide so as to relieve the world of the burden they perceive themselves to be. Younger people often commit suicide because of the failure to live up to societal expectations, particularly academic and educational ones. There's almost a sense of cultural piety behind it, completely lacking in the West. Now, by contrast, think of politicians in the West, such as Richard Nixon, otherwise known as Tricky Dick, or Bill Clinton. These were men accused of corrupt behavior, which turned out to be true, but a Korean-style response was never forthcoming. Instead, Nixon quietly resigned in the wake of the Watergate scandal and was later pardoned, and Clinton reveled in the attention heaped upon him in light of his sex scandal with Monica Lewinsky. It's arguable that suicide in light of these things might have been a cultural and psychological impossibility for these men. There's yet another interesting phenomenon concerning suicide in South Korea, unfamiliar to the West, and that is the phenomenon of suicide by way of solidarity. One of the most prominent examples of this was the suicide of the famous Korean actress Choi Jin-sil, who was known as the nation's actress and committed suicide in October of 2008. In response to this, there was a temporary 70% increase in suicide in South Korea. Her brother also committed suicide sometime later. Choi Jin-sil was known as the nation's actress. When she hanged herself in her bathroom in October of 2008, a wave of sympathetic suicide swept South Korea, and 1,700 people took their lives in the following month. End quote. Much of this can be attributed to modernization and the disassembly of traditional family structures. Looking at it from a genetic perspective in terms of the S variant of the polymorphism 5-HTT-LPR, people who have this variant, and thus the majority of the Korean population, will likely be more susceptible to depression and affective disorders, and the traditionally close-knit families, communities, and collectivist structures have slowly but surely disappeared in favor of a more individualistic Western-style approach to career, family, and life in general. This might well be described as maladaptive in the Korean context. If the S variant had been selected for in the majority of Koreans over centuries because it had short-term and later long-term benefits, and had been selected for in a specific cultural environment, then the dissolution of that environment would mean that this allele, along with other genetic cultural sensitivity markers mentioned previously, are no longer adaptive in the current environment, and the time span within which these changes have occurred has been far too short to allow for adaptive change. We thus see depression, anxiety, and suicide at increasing rates in South Korea. This, at least, is a reasonable hypothesis to my mind. Burden and shame fit well with the concept of a shame society. Shame society is a cultural anthropological term used to describe the social structure, which is maintained by imparting shame and exclusion to those who do not conform to or live up to the expectations the community has placed upon them. China, Japan, South Korea all fit the model of a shame society to varying degrees. The West, in particular Europe and the younger United States, fits the model of a guilt society, with Christian doctrine very much being at its fulcrum. Paul G. Hebert, a missionizing theorist, described a shame society as follows. Shame is a reaction to other people's criticism, an acute personal chagrin at our failure to live up to our obligations and expectations others have of us. In true shame-oriented cultures, every person has a place and a duty in the society. One maintains self-respect, not by choosing what is good rather than what is evil, but by choosing what is expected of one. End quote. All of the features thus far discussed are the product of the coevolution of genes and biological changes that became culturally adaptive, or as it has turned out now, maladaptive in some cases. As mentioned prior, we need to understand that genetic populations are defined by allele frequency that characterizes them. If we return to the polymorphism 5-HTT-LPR, it is clear that some proportion of South Koreans, albeit a small one, will have the L variant and not the S variant. And assuming this is correlated with greater individualism, such individuals will not be particularly happy in such a collectivist culture. Indeed, I have met many Koreans in my time who have bristled under the rigid Confucian system and the endless expectations Korean society places on them. Such individuals, I have observed, do far better in Western societies than in Eastern ones, and are generally happier and more productive in the former rather than the latter. My ex-wife, a Korean, though not the sharpest tool in the shed, was much happier in American and European society than her own, for example. I have no doubt that in time, many such genetic discoveries will be made, and these will help us to understand the relationship of culture to biology and genes, and why certain societies develop the way they do. What has been discussed here is merely the tip of the iceberg. However, it is important to understand why we discuss this at all. My purpose is to lay bare human nature, with the long-term desire of man eventually altering and transcending human nature itself, which is something that is impossible to do if we remain in a state of denial concerning genetic differences across human populations, something very common on the left and is essentially a mainstream position in academia and the public at large. I also believe that an honest public discussion of genetic differences is important because if it does not take place, the topic will be the sole province of racial ideologues who will only use the knowledge when the science is convenient to them and reject it when it is not, and will be all too happy to mix it into whatever propaganda they deem necessary for their cause. Neither the mainstream obfuscatory left nor the emergent racially oriented right is particularly concerned with objectivity and truth, and frankly, why should they be? Each has a political agenda that many in both camps agree can and should be justified in achieving via propaganda and half-truths, and an agenda of scientific discovery, unhindered by political considerations, is unlikely to be supported by either, because there will always be something that remains unpalatable or unfavorable and thus must be suppressed. And this is why I do this. And lest I forget to mention the fence-sitters, sometimes called anti-SJWs, or anti-feminists, or amorphous cultural libertarians. Well, they might be entertaining to some, but they do virtually nothing to actually move us forward. They are a trend, a marketable, self-important trend that may even have a smidgen of value, but a trend nonetheless. They can talk about irrelevancies until they are blue in the face, and the next YouTube market paradigm shift takes place, whenever that happens. They are entertainers, and they largely do nothing to help the cause of scientific discovery and human exploration. Now more than ever, we need clear thinkers who are interested in the data and making available as much information as possible to the public. I am unconcerned with the valences of left and right, only the necessity of dissecting human nature, so finally, in the end, we might have the tools to change and improve it. If we do not at least attempt this, we will find ourselves forever mired in a swamp of our primeval instincts and drives, lost in an endless cycle of repetition of the past with no light cast forward towards the future. And thus is born the necessity of what I am attempting to do here. It might be in vain and doomed to failure, but an attempt must nevertheless be made. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.